tiny little college, so I'm not mic'd very often. So is this all right, the volume? Okay, tell me if I start screaming into it like a TV creature or something. I'm very honored to be here with you. It's a great delight after some years of coming to 4S and sitting through the plenary sessions on Saturday night. That I have to say I'm astonished that there's so many people here on a nice night in a nice city. So I'm hopeful that we can have a great conversation around this as we go on. And I'll start with a question which some of you might have been thinking about as the day was getting long and you were in loud or hot rooms. The question is life worth living? Is life worth living? Such was the title that the American philosopher William James gave to a speech he delivered before a group of young men at Harvard in 1895. Is life worth living? Although James told his audience that the answer was yes, good to know, he also proposed that no simple accounting could ever determine this kind of worth. The real value of life, according to James, would always exceed man's ability to calculate. James clarified this point by means of a story he recalled from his medical student days, likening the limited grasp that we humans have of our lives to the experiences of a dog being vivisected in a laboratory. The dog, James said, lies strapped on the board and shrieking at his executioners, and to his own dark consciousness is literally in a sort of hell. If only the poor dog could understand, though, the relief of future sufferings to be bought through the painful experiments, James continued, speaking for the dog, all that is heroic in him would religiously acquiesce. I start with James's parable about the speechless dog, not simply because it points us towards matters of science, suffering, silence, and survival, but more specifically for the way it animates those subjects through the titular question of worth. Is life worth living? Is the survival of future beasts worth the vivisection of the individual? Is the progress of science worth acquiescence to excruciating pain? For James, problems of ethics and politics are necessarily problems of comparable worth, of what we might call reasonable suffering. Indeed, for James, as for others working in liberal philosophical traditions, the determination of reasonable suffering is a key place where problems of ethics, of how one should live, intersect problems in politics, of how we should live. Just when does judicious acquiescence tip into imprudent, perhaps even subhuman docility? Exactly which political arrangements demand patient endurance, and which instead call for collective insurrection, maybe even violent insurrection? I draw attention to the conjoining of reason and suffering in James's speech in order to contemplate what recent studies of science might bring to the dilemma of comparable worth, which continues to inform so much individual and collective decision-making. I do so both to reflect on how we in social studies of science complicate received liberal framings of ethical and political calculation, and also to consider what remains to be done. And I'll admit at the outset that my thoughts on that latter problem of what remains to be done are inchoate at best, and I hope that we'll have a little time at the end for you to join me in what can only be a little bit of thinking out loud. To begin, though, let's consider how social studies of science have refracted James's philosophical question about life's worthiness. The field's done so, I think, primarily by tracing the complex arrangements of normative, technical, and political elements that endow particular forms of vitality with worth. Making life valuable, it turns out, takes a lot of effort. Michelle Murphy, for example, takes us through the procedures by which the malaise of sick building syndrome is materialized or dematerialized in particular settings. Sarah Jan illuminates how U.S. injury law renders some losses of life financially compensable, precisely by rendering other loss unrecognizable. Meanwhile, Margaret Locke, Stefan Timmermans, and others reminds us that even something as seemingly solid as death is invested with value in highly contingent and mutable ways. In each such case, as Nicholas Rose and Carlos Novas point out, value at once ethical and economic is crafted and contested in terms of the suffering of individuals or groups, in terms of their rights to survival. While these scholars are focusing on the mutability of suffering, other social studies of science concentrate instead on the constitution of what we might call calculative reason. Adam Smith once famously asserted that the trucking or trading instinct is the most basic feature of human nature. Science studies instead show us that the historical specificity of regimes of calculability and incalculability, writings by Michel Caland, Sean Ha, or the papers in today's sessions on calculative agencies, for instance, show calculative reason to inhere not in individuated human actors, but more importantly in distributed networks of disparate elements, technologies, regulations, academic disciplines, and so on. In short, social studies of science takes James's philosophical question and subjects it to empirical analysis, investigating the material processes through which particular lives are endowed with prescriptive value. My interest has been in tracing the mutual dependence of these two processes. That is to say, how assessments of suffering necessitate attributions of calculative reason, and how those attributions of reason, in turn, enable the authorization of real pain. And you'll understand, obviously, that I'm lumping a bunch together here in the interest of time. I would say reasons and sufferings to kind of highlight the multiplicity, but that'll get a little awkward, so just work with me. I pursued this interest as part of a larger effort to historicize norms of individual choice and all those related categories of intentionality and responsibility and so forth, the linchpins of contemporary neoliberalism. And in this respect, I see the work I'm trying to do on individual consent as half of a joint project I share with Jimmy Reardon, whose research focuses, as most of you know, on the construction of group consent. And so we go back and forth on thinking that through. To put it a little differently, I'm trying to understand how determinations of reasonable suffering enable neoliberal governance, systems of thought and practice premise, like liberalism before it, on the deferral of present enjoyment in the name of some imagined future. Before we go any further, though, let me pause to say that I think it's pretty crucial to maintain analytic distinctions between forms of liberal governance, broadly conceived, and forms of outright state-sanctioned enslavement, situations in which power relations have become relatively immobilized, stuck, prevented from any reversibility of movement. These I would call, following Foucault, states of domination, states in which practices of freedom can hardly be said to be in existence. Like so much of the work on this week's conference program, my research tends to focus not on states of domination, but on more microphysical apparatuses of power. Power established through a certain kind of relationship of oneself to oneself. And it's only in these latter situations in which the practice of freedom, including calculations of reasonable suffering, really become relevant. But it's precisely because one of my chief analytical aims is to flesh out the relations between these two kinds of situations, how they rely on and enable one another, that I think it's important we not confuse them, as, say, James did when he welcomed his audience of young Harvard men to imagine their affluent ennui as analogous to the pain experienced by a dog on the vivisectionist table. It seems fair to say that power operates rather differently in the two situations. But within that relatively circumscribed domain of liberal governance, I've been trying to focus on what might be called voluntary suffering, that kind of suffering that one inflicts, ostensibly willingly, on oneself. Don't ask me about the personal background of this. People often do that. It's not that interesting. So in the book that Lee mentioned, Suffering for Science, I studied these practices of voluntary suffering among various communities of professional scientists in late 19th century America. And this period was important because it's when the nation is shifting from bondage to contract as its dominant mode of government. It had, for hundreds of years, legally sanctioned enslavement, and it was adopting a new, more liberal form of governmentality. In the wake of the abolition of racial slavery, professional scientists began expressing an enthusiasm for suffering. Enthusiasm was their word, telling word, which extended even to the point where their own physical survival was at stake. And this included a whole range of people. Bacteriologists who would inject themselves with things to see what might happen, X-ray experimenters who would expose themselves to radiation until they were falling off, kind of chunk by chunk, and they keep doing more research and more research and more research. The stories themselves are pretty captivating, but since it's an after-dinner talk, I'll spare most of the details later. These accounts of willing slavery, this was their language, willing slavery, help illuminate a few important attributes of this larger problem of reasonable suffering. First, and I'm hoping I'm not giving away too much of the book here, first it turns out that the capacity for voluntary suffering required the possession of a certain kind of self. one whose alleged capacity for independent volition, one could self-sacrifice voluntarily, depended on the disavowal of others' capacity for autonomous action. Those beings historically positioned as lacking full self-possession, and there's a whole range of people, formerly enslaved people, wives, laboratory technicians, you can imagine. None of these beings were read as being fully consensual, and hence were not capable of suffering voluntarily. Those who endured suffering simply for lack of alternative, as in the case of the technician's wage slavery, say, or in the wife's marital obligations, signaled only the emasculating debasements of bondage. Those who pursued suffering for its own pleasure, as with the masochists then starting to be studied by Freud and Krafft-Ebing, signaled not reason, but madness. Only the elect few could choose to suffer, and in so doing, elevate themselves into the lofty position of sacrificial scientists. And yet, of course, this brings us right smack into that important matter of choice, and hence back to the matter of calculative reason. It's here that we find what is to me the more surprising and hence more interesting element of these scientists' willing slavery, namely that they were pretty ambivalent about calculative reason itself. In calling for sacrifice in the name of science, late 19th century scientists engaged not merely the value of various types of suffering as compared to various forms of knowledge obtained, whether, say, some new fact about nature was worth a particular colleague's dismemberment. The more important and controversial question for these actors was whether science was a domain that exceeded such economic calculation, that it was valuable precisely because it stood in opposition to the hegemonic trading instinct that they saw kind of coming into being. Now, for some, this wasn't really a complicated question. Labor for science was akin to any other contractual exchange, a forfeiture undertaken in the name of expected return of equal or greater value, advantageous salaries, professional renown, or at least some little tiny chunk of knowledge. The chief ambiguity in such circumstances was merely one of predictive accounting, whether suffering would be adequately compensated. The only thing to be certain of, one writer reflected in the wake of a particularly deadly set of self-experiments, is that the knowledge gained is worth the sacrifice of human life. For others, however, and these are the ones I find most interesting, for others, the relationship between scientists and science couldn't be contained by such calculations. For these writers, as for James, any effort to put a price to the scientist's suffering was inherently misguided, since the result of the exchange could never be known. After all, as one wrote, only God knows what a fact is worth. For such scientists, to sacrifice oneself for science implied a loss, an uncompensated expenditure, an unrestricted offering. As one proponent put it, a sacrifice which involves no real loss and impoverishment, or which ultimately leads to personal gain, is not true self-sacrifice. The calculated gift, an offering tendered with expectation of return, was no self-sacrifice at all. Again, advocates of this version of suffering for science valued painful efforts precisely because they carried no promise of reciprocity. Because, as one put it, the ultimate of science is infinite. Something whose possession is the final good and yet beyond all reach. Something which is the ultimate ideal and yet the hopeless quest. The value of such a hopeless infinite quest stemmed precisely from its superseding of everyday contractual relations. As the journal Science put it in 1896, scientific labor is not like other fields of work, but instead, my favorite quote, but instead like the chase after the foot of the rainbow, which moves ever onward as it is pursued. According to such advocates, science proceeds not through reasoned calculation, but through ostentatious and temperate forfeiture, through what one prominent chemist referred to as self-immolation on the altar of science. Now, contemplating the ethical and economic value given to unreason among these scientists, many of whom actually did immolate themselves, think of these X-ray guys dropping off chunk by chunk, led me away from some of the presumptions I had started the project with, that suffering is that thing you want to avoid, or that survival is that thing you want to seek. They flew in the face of all this. Suffering has only become more confusing to me as I get further into my current book project, which focuses more squarely on medicine. That domain whose stated aim, at least articulated by the Multinational Goals in Medicine Project, is, quote, the relief of suffering. Determinations of reasonable suffering, of comparable worth, present themselves continuously to those drawn into the global biomedical complex, from doctors and patients to international NGOs and insurance adjusters, where the matter is often posed as one of medical necessity. As Paul Farmer puts it, careful assessment of severity of suffering is important, at least to physicians, who must practice triage. What suffering needs to be taken care of first? I couldn't have said it better myself. In contemporary biomedicine, the philosophic question of life's worth appears as an urgent matter of praxis, forged from engagement with a world plagued by enormous and growing global disparities in health and wealth. What suffering needs to be taken care of first? And yet, the somewhat obvious trouble about the methodology Farmer proposes for addressing this matter of comparable worth, what suffering needs to be addressed first, is the tacit installation of science as the ultimate arbiter of suffering's value. Suffering appears for Farmer, as for James before him, as a matter best adjudicated by the prudent medical authority. Careful assessment of severity is important. Again, it's pretty crucial not to lose sight here of the distinctions between states of domination and other forms of power relation, and Partners in Health, as you all know, continues to concentrate on horrifically brutal states of domination. And yet it strikes me that science studies, and transnational feminist science studies in particular, is uniquely positioned to understand just how easily these table-thumping claims on the real, you've been in those seminars where someone says this table is real, right? Including table-thumping moments on the nature of real suffering. This suffering is real, we know it's real, can act to mask that volatile encounter between states of domination and practices of freedom. When black-boxed, suffering in quotation marks now, becomes a ready repository for any number of sentimentalizing or primitivizing identifications, posing then as a justification for a whole range of unilateral interventions. I'm obviously writing from the US at a particular moment in time. Having complicated, though, the goal of relief of future sufferings, having complicated the existence of autonomous voluntaristic subjects with identifiable interests, here's what happens. What happens to that all-important question of cui bono? Who benefits? Who suffers? Who survives? What grounds emancipatory knowledge if not liberation from unwanted, involuntary suffering? Given that precisely what qualifies as suffering is so often the pivot of ethical and political dispute, and that something called science is so often summoned to resolve such dispute reasonably, might there be a way to think both with and against the telos of liberation from suffering? To think both with and against received methods of weighing and comparing value? For help with these questions, as with so many, let me move towards close by turning to that other influential American philosopher of dogs, Donna Haraway. In her recent writings on companion species, Haraway begins from the assumption that there's no place of innocence from which to ground ethics and politics, that we're all already cyborgs or monsters or vampires or, of course. Since, as she says, none of us can get through a single day without killing, the task she proposes is instead to make sure that we kill with our eyes open, that we refuse to make what we kill killable, to convert it into bare life. A Harawayian feminism, if you'll give me that, Harawayian feminism begins with the intense, caring work of remembering, of recalling who eats and who is eaten, who lives and who dies, and who, as she delicately puts it, cleans up the shit. In the face of grotesquely unequal distributions of economic and military violence, Haraway insists that flourishing, not merely the relief of suffering, is the core value she hopes to extend, where compassionate action is, of course, crucial to an ethic of flourishing. Haraway seems to identify something called kinship, rather than the liberal ideal of justice, as the route to compassionate action. To that still relevant political cry, no justice, no peace, we might now add no kinship, no flourishing. And Although I'm squeamish, I have to admit, partly in the wake of some talks that I've heard these past few days, about the ways that kinship, particularly genetic kinship, might simply replay old forms of possession and dispossession. And here I'm thinking of Kim Talbert's remarks just yesterday about DNA print genomic kits and the commodification of genetic ancestry. I think I follow Haraway in seeking to articulate alternative modes of belonging, a collective movement towards what she calls the barely discernible figure of an elsewhere. Thank you. We have time for a couple questions or comments tonight. I hope some. Yeah, please.
What is the relationship between pain and suffering?
That's a great question. It's a great question. It's a moving relationship, I think. In the book, one of the things that's happening in the period that I'm talking about is the two things are getting separated and reworked in some way. In the sense that pain becomes a kind of question of nociception, of bodies, human or non-human, having nerve endings which respond to stimuli in a particular way and might be measured or adjudicated with machines and various things. Suffering maintains that older sort of religious lineage of something much more subjective than simply nociception. And it maintains this even as suffering is trying to be sort of quantified and objectified in a particular way. And I used suffering rather than pain in the book. That I mean, it's an open question how everyone else is going to be thinking about suffering. But the way I used suffering in the book was because that was the way the scientists talked about it. They did not talk about pain, except when they were reporting the really technical way on a lab report about some pain of something they had done to themselves. The pain was blah blah blah. You know, it was simply a reportage. But the regular word they used when they were talking about what one must do in order to be a scientist was suffer. And they were picking up that explicit religious history. This is why that word enthusiasm is so important. If you think about it, because the word literally comes from in theos, right? God within. And so they have this enthusiastic kind of passion for suffering.
One more question.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to, if you could talk some more about how you think about the status of the science as using a performative language for suffering and its relation to the political economy of the time.
Right, thank you. No, it's very helpful. I tried to argue in the book that they weren't the only ones using the language of suffering, and the rhetoric of suffering in the American context specifically was huge in the kind of last quarter of the 19th century. And I argued in part, as slavery was receding into the past, you could now sort of, suffering became a sort of romantic, sentimentalized thing, which it was pretty hard to do when there were people in coffles, you know, and their children told and things like that. It was hard to talk about suffering for the corporation or for your art with quite the same moral, you know, but after 1875, that all sorts of starts changing, and people are using a very inflated rhetoric of suffering to talk about missionary work, to talk about artistic endeavors, to talk about all kinds of other things as well. I was worried, and a lot of reviewers of early work said this is only rhetoric, though, and when you get beneath the rhetoric, you see the reality of personal gain. That they say, I'm suffering so much, and they do it to get higher salaries, and they do get higher salaries. Or they say, I'm suffering so much, and they, you know, they do it to, you can see where this goes. And the reviewers were very insistent on this, that I was missing the reality of gain in the wake of the rhetoric. And what I thought the reviewers were missing, and so what I spent a lot of time arguing in the book, was that the point was there was a debate among them about whether this was about gain or whether it was about something quite different. And I paid attention to the rhetoric and the way rhetoric changed and the way rhetoric was used, but this was a time at which the scientists were so self-conscious about being a part of a new endeavor as it was being professionalized and institutionalized, that any kind of easy way of dividing between private or public performative speech sort of breaks down. And one example, for instance, is Robert Peary, who was one of the people I write about, one of the early American polar explorers, was so self-conscious about the way he presented himself as being fundamental to the legitimacy of the knowledge he produced, that he would write drafts of the telegrams that he wrote. And you can see them in the National Archives, draft upon draft upon draft of his performative speech. And these were his technical notebooks. And somebody was just incensed when somebody wrote, you can imagine these guys stuck at the North Pole for many, many months in the dark. Somebody wrote a rude remark in indelible pencil on the side of one of these lab notebooks. And Peary had, there's no ceiling in the North Pole. He was quite outraged because this was going to now be part of the public record. He understood that there was no divide between the private notebooks and the public science. That sort of line that we might assume now between different forms of rhetoric, they both understood and were manipulating these. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's I can tell from what I know that there's an almost uncanny line of reasoning that flows through all of these talks, and I think you'll see that begin to appear. My next speaker is Samsa Husalo, who is at the Helsinki Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Helsinki.
Last talk was so good that I need eyes. As they always run. We'll see, this always should work. And in fact, the talk is about how it should work. I think we have it. In the face of suffering and sacrifice, whatever is said next appears rather trivial, I believe. But we can take this as a kind of calmer spot between heavier topics. So I know Stefan's going to talk about death. And I want to start this off quite light. So, title of my talk, as said, is Noise of Learning in Silencing the Security of the Elderly. And that is one of those portrayals which is very hard to do anything better with words. But this cartoon, originally published in the most widespread newspaper in Finland, also reminds us that findings and insights the researchers put forward face tough competition to be heard. From pictures as well as from headlines. These are all related to the monitor and alarm technology for elders. I'll focus in this talk. My personal favorite is the how to exploit the grey panthers with new indicators of self to save the aging society kind of storyline you can read through those headings. Fortunately, however, in science and technology studies on design and use, we have a very strong track record on very catchy concepts too. Beginning from Langdon Winner's Artifacts Having Politics, Steve Wolgar's Configuring the User, and Madeleine Akrich's Description of Technological Objects. Such concepts have done important work in conveying STS insights and taking them forward. However, I was still sidelined with Robin Williams in insisting that in order to gain more nuanced understanding of how technologies affect people and people affect technologies, we need to move on from the comfort of effective, powerful, metaphorical statements, and in particular, the stories and research designs embedded in them. In studies of design and use, this concern is accentuated in regard to the third theme of this conference, survival, and less dramatically put, persistence. Other way of saying the above, because that might have just appeared quite cryptic, is that restricting analysis to any moment, aspect, or granularity of data in the biography of technology tends to yield a clearer message that various audiences for STS tend to pick and use for their own purposes more easily. So, in a sense, it becomes more influential. But I would argue that there's a twist here, because in the absence of conflict in data, which also helps the producer such a nice closure, it also runs the risk of turning into silence or into mere assumptions events that happen elsewhere or upstream or downstream of the site that was studied, as well as below and above the radar of analyst. And this is basically what I tried to convey to you, and as it is quite late, I'm going to turn it into a kind of a storyline, which kind of substantiates what I mean by that. So I now turn to monitoring technologies for elders. In doing so, I rely on what ended up being a study using several timescales of analysis within what some people would call microscale of analysis, as well as ending up studying several different peoples, which wasn't intended to begin with. In practice, that meant blending ethnographic interview and historiographic data and some interventionist attempts together. The vertical lines here represent periods where more intensive contact was sought, and the intensity of color, the relative granularity of data, basically brighter the denser, in this case moving from ethnographic data to relying on interviews and documents only. But on to the first perspective. Now you have some idea where this is coming from. Soon after I started my field work on design of innovative monitoring device for elders in 1999, I became very concerned that the work of caregiving might get silenced by this technology in a manner that might not be in the best interest of the elders either. The focus of the engineers I studied was on the abstract elder isolated in her own apartment and having a serious attack of illness. Imagery of person falling down and lying unconscious and with fractured hip, not able to reach a phone, was at the core of their portrayal of the distress of elders. It was accompanied by descriptions of strokes, diabetic shocks, etc., all of which 24/7 monitoring and proactive alarms about fluctuations in users' physiology would prevent. In this portrayal, what surrounded the suffering of the person was out of sight. The care rounds and check-in visits by home care workers, calls by relatives and neighbors were all gone, as well as regular changing of dirty diapers and washings, where the condition of most elderly people using this kind of technologies would be put to trial every single day, typically many times every single day. The engineers were These engineers were initially far more concerned about their capability to configure the system than their ability to configure its users. It was, in engineering terms, a very ambitious project. In fact, on the basis of once redesigning the equipment and procedures in an alarm center, they believed that poorly documented and ill-codified female work in elderly care was low paid for a very good reason. They were thus convinced that their technology and the associated new way of monitoring elders would transform this work only for the better. But this way of foregrounding somewhat purified insecurity and seeking to transform the existing security in caregiving presented also a quandary. The rhetorical replacement, probably necessary for their business case, I still believe these days, demanded that their technological solution would be able to reach quite wide and varying set of conditions where elderly might run into problems. This cartoon, you already know, wasn't accidentally picked as an opening line, for it captures the heart of this quandary quite well by portraying the innovation of gadgets, all measuring different aspects related to security, not quite replacing the pre-existing practices for providing care and security. Now, that probably sounded to like a very kind of arrogant STS line on criticizing the engineers, but that was actually their voice about it. For they saw this picture, and they were the ones who gave me this cartoon, as that's the past, and now the future is going to look like this. And I must admit, this is when the system had evolved to its second generation, and they had enough finances to get good advertisement agency and so forth, and it is a very ambitious concept. With this, however, I want to introduce the second perspective to this technology, and that is home care workers. When I went to study their work and live in institutions for elderly care, I was surprised that most of these people were quite enthusiastic about this technology, which I could perceive as potentially dangerous. Many voiced that it was helpful in raising the standard and public image of their work. And indeed, in this joining of hands between nurse, elder, and technology, there is a quite remarkable halo. However, there were also false alarms at night, swelling and itchy arms, cumbersome software interfaces, missed emergencies, etc., which were accepted for some time. But when they continued, they began to rub against how far home care workers and elders were willing to accommodate their lives and work. In a voice of one of the nurses working in a rest home, as I'm second language speaker, I prefer to have these quotes in print as well. In the beginning, there were just too many alarms. This is especially so at night when you're all alone in this ward. If you're doing something else, especially giving a treatment to a patient, and the alarm goes off, it's not a pleasant situation. Just think of putting in stitches or taking care of sanitary operations. You have to stop, take off your rubber glove, reach for the device, sign in the alarm, rush to the computer, and see how acute the matter is. So against this backdrop, what followed was not very surprising. There was a fair number of ad hoc solutions, workarounds, and redefinitions of technology by its users, almost as kind of STS insights, what I was reading, come to flesh. And thus, perhaps, so in a sense, studying and equally, perhaps unsurprisingly, studying the actual usages turned the storyline growing from my findings from one of configuring the users towards the tones of creative use of technology and anti-programs. At this point, which was roughly 1.5 years of field work, the effects of this technology seemed now quite firmly in the hands of its users, and it looked clear that they would force the designers to downgrade the transformative potential to fairly benign changes in the life of elders and work of their caregivers. It looked like, well, basically having a healthy stock of data in place, it looked like there also was a fairly coherent frame for addressing the details, how designers and users had affected each other. In fact, a frame that this picture once again captures quite well. That there is this high push, and then there is this silent resistance, which turns out to be quite effective. Still reading the book. But in this case, it turned out to be a bit more complicated, or actually, the crux is that it turned out to be quite different. I was also interested in exploring where the engineers got their ideas in the first place. While there was no primordial beginning, it is clear that in early 1990s and ever since, tens of companies and projects have been after very similar concepts. The latest addition to the bunch I found just this spring in a partner search for Assistant Ambient Living EU program, when a group of Spanish engineers wanted to experiment with a novel concept for elders. Here's a screenshot of the announcement. I'll leave it on for a while, but basically the system envisioned here is nearly identical to what engineers I studied proposed as their next generation system in 1994. And this is not a singular outlining case. There is tens of these kinds of projects. When I plunged deeper into the history of safety phone alarms and practices in producing them, they started to make sense. The appeal for this kind of monitoring stems from what I would call practice-bound imaginary in developing of safety alarm systems. Sets of tools, ways of doing and imagining, desires, expectations, models, procedures, and norms are bound together to form a somewhat coherent whole that animates this practice. Furthermore, they make this practice appear appear to be bound for a prospective future state, and also that this state is bound to be realized in one way or another, continuing to foreground certain visions, ideas, and kinds of artifacts as worth pursuing, even if projects seem to embody them, face persistent difficulties and even failures, as nearly all these systems have. More specifically, the appeal for this kind of pervasive monitoring of elders stems from interanimation of several practice plan imaginaries. The prominent ones relate to technology production, practices in technology management and investment, development of monitoring technologies in medical technologies, and policy making about elderly care that have been partially converging during the last 2 decades or so. In the voice of one of the designers, after their second round of redesigns in the system, we shall see how well they manage to hold on, but it's certain that this won't fall as a concept. It might be that it has to be done with a different technology and in a different way, but even in the worst case, some of us might be able to continue with this. It is certain that this kind of device will be made. Now, this voice spirals us back towards the irritations in the learning associated with shaping of technology. Combining several fields in the set of artifacts and service models took 5 years for the engineers I studied. But it took another 5 years to redesign the system so it could begin to create the kind of silences elderly, their caregivers, as well as investors, health technology regulators, and social care decision makers could find acceptable and understandable. This social learning, there were moments characterized by kind of joy of problem solving, which management literature tends to be quite fond of these days. But it was equally characterized by the above-told irritations for elders, as well as designers' regular 16-hour, 7 days a week anguishes in the face of major problems in system, and moreover, very painful questioning how much of the original design logic could be let go and still keep the system working and being able to progress with it. And now we come to the one and only message I would like to convey with this talk, or I think it might make some sense. Today it remains very uncertain how the changed technology will survive, and more importantly, which aspects of it are the ones that shall persist, the next technologies, and affect the future elders and their caregivers. It is interesting to see whether, or almost rather when, where, and how the proactive alarms about fluctuations in physiology will be reinvented. Equally significant is whether and how some of the interface details, shapes, and alarm messaging solutions shall be picked up by competitors in safety phone business or in somewhat analogous applications for other user groups. In regard to the initial concern in silencing the caregiving of elders, a crucial point may be if and how some of the locally hard-won lessons here with this technology reorient future development projects in this company and in other locales when they are seeking security systems for elders. At the same time, it may turn out that the most significant effect from this technology and several next of kin come from seemingly benign direction. For these monitoring alarm systems happen to introduce PC in nursing homes. And PCs come with email, browser, and spreadsheets, and so forth and so on. Not unlike Bruno Latour's earth scientists discovering and advancing jungle over savanna, PC use happens to prepare terrain for increasing use of digital technology in care for elders. These and many other inheritances or partial inheritances shaped by and shaping engineers, elderly caregivers, and various third parties continue to craft the silences that continue to persist around the security of elders in sites that use and may end up adopting this kind of technology. And then turning back to STS. If we want, we can now read into this picture a condensed social history of alarm devices for the elderly, multiple simultaneous locales driving towards simultaneous designs, mostly unawares of each other, as well as future visions in the monitoring of security of elders, even the various inheritances. But I think this metaphor would be running quite thin and begin to do silencing that we would probably all feel quite uncomfortable with. By turning the questions questions of persistence and learning back to STS, we can revisit the question, how can we move on in our understanding how technologies affect people and people affect technologies? I could have used several, but not that huge array. This has been one of the kind of unconcerning points in my acquaintance with STS thus far. To argue that it makes a difference whether or not we follow development processes at length while attending also details of minute-by-minute work in designing and using. For these persistencies, they do not come visible without it. If we do so, studying technology in practice means also providing a dynamic view to how different layers and elements of socio-technical configurations develop. In other words, we need not only look at configuring the user or anti-programs, but rather a series of prefigurations, refigurations, and possible joint configurations of technology, use, and design. This further begs for frameworks that sensitize analysts to looking at dynamics of learning and power simultaneously, as well as social construction of technology, but also construction of communities and all those instances where these partial inheritances are found. And to be able to see how friendliness and docility emerge between technologies and people. This brings me to my final remark, which is about the role of STS research in the face of silent suffering and survival. In the case as described, the learning between different stakeholders has been slow, cumbersome, and still continues to be quite frail. In this and other studies, we've repeatedly seen how newly appointed management brushes aside mutually fruitful collaboration practices between designers and users. In the collective experience of our research group, an agreement to possibly intervene on a basis of research findings has rather worked to deepen STS inquiry, sensitize to power and organizational dynamics, and practical relevance of our work, rather than suppress those issues, which is an argument that one hears quite often. In this and other cases, it has also occurred, perhaps for this audience very unsurprisingly, but I still want to stress the point, that STS researchers can participate in meaningful ways in remediating persistent sore points that evade the correction mechanisms that people study have in place. And I think I probably want to leave it at that, because Stefan is going to speak about warrants for STS, and I don't want to take any of these talk away. If anybody is inclined to make a question.
You said that the authors themselves introduced you to this picture.
Yeah,
What's their take on it?
their take on it was basically that this was the past of various gadgets that didn't do the job that they were supposed to. They got this through having coverage of newspaper, everything that related to elderly care or monitoring technologies. They got all the news through an agency.
And there was no cautionary message.
I think the cautionary message there was they wouldn't have given me the kind of access I got to all their meetings, let alone the executive board, to basically study whatever they did, because they were just at a point when they started to realize that they actually might have a problem. That their very ambitious design logic was they were regarding it as reliability problem, that and they still are regarding it as a reliability problem. But they were also starting to, this I find quite fascinating, that they were starting to realize that if they can mitigate the reliability problems through having the technology be more configurable or somehow fitting better to the practice of elderly care and elderly lives, they might kind of get away with it easier. But they gradually started to understand that actually a big part of the reliability problem, or what they framed as reliability problem, came through that the device didn't accommodate the range of different conditions and various, often quite contingent work situations where whatever happened with the technology, which wasn't planned, conflicted quite severely with what people were doing. And there was a quite radical shift in how they perceived collaboration with. At the end of my study, they actively sought collaboration with institutions for elderly care. There's some nice quotes about it, like the best thing that has happened this last year is that we established this collaboration between the institution right across the street, where we can test our devices on a daily basis, like that, which was quite, I felt, a bit of a fight. Anyone else?
Thank you so much. Our next contestant is Stefan Timmerman from University of California at Los Angeles. It gives me a special thrill as a former student of mine to now have a colleague who's speaking about issues that are important and complex.
Thank you very much, Lee. Conference under your belt. We're in Vancouver, a happening place, and you are listening to what surely must be the least cheerful plenary in 30 years of history. Congratulations. So I'm going to talk about cutting open dead bodies. I will not add a happy note to the proceedings here, but to reward just exemplary attendance here, I'm going to tag a public health message at the end of my talk aimed at keeping you alive. Based on my research, I can go for keeping you alive or giving you tips of getting away with murder, but I thought I aim for preserving rather than thinning out our ranks. Okay. One medical examiner's emblem consists of an ornamental shield flanked by a single word: hope. The choice of hope might seem strange and even inappropriate in a place that deals daily with grim and painful situations. Hope implies that we are not determined by either our biology or our circumstances, and that we can exercise other options. As Mary Jo Good explored, a political economy of hope informs much palliative care and medical disciplines with high mortality rates such as oncology. In forensics, the deceased has no hope for cure or care. Death has occurred, often too suddenly, violently, and unexpectedly. Hope in forensics, however, refers not to the deceased, but to the people left behind. The forensic investigators I studied hoped that the expert knowledge they produced would provide closure for grieving relatives. A death investigator articulated this mission. Quote, "I can give people back their loved ones, but I can give them the truth. Then they will be free to grieve for the dead, and then free to start living again. Truth like that can be a humbling and sacred gift for a scientist to give." If hope is medical examiners' orienting theme, what is the raison d'etre for science and technology scholars? As Rabanov puts it, we are second-order scientists, or to put it less charitably, parasites making a living of other scientists. What answer do we have to the dreaded "so what" question when we leave our forest in-group and mingle with others? For whom or for what do we study science and technology? The short canned answers that we provide on IRB forms when asked to explain the benefits of participating in research indicates that such benefits are not always that evident. When studying forensic pathologists, I wondered what I could contribute. Medical examiners are low on the totem pole of contemporary medicine. If a hospital physician suggests you should check out a career in forensic medicine, it usually means that they do not think you can make it in clinical settings. Still, the people I followed for several years were powerful and authoritative in ordering deaths that rearranged how individual lives would be remembered and incorporated as data points in the workings of countless institutions. So what was my task here? For whom or for what do we pursue science studies? Each of us has to figure this question out, and as a group, we have come up with some common answers while heatedly debating other alternatives. One answer of many is to turn inwards, to generate factual knowledge for ourselves. We construct theories, concepts, and solve puzzles as an intellectual engagement with others in various communities. Our relevance is foremost theoretical, thus we introduce concepts in the hope that they will receive traction and illuminate the other people's work. STS research is haunted by the paradox that our findings need to fit the texture of the works and lives of our subjects, yet somehow not be apparent to them. As a result, our bottom line consists of an alternative version of how things came to be. What scientists recognize as the truth or factual, we say is actually different, more social, structurally patterned, organizationally contingent, culturally dependent, and problematic than acknowledged. A second classical answer is to reframe the question politically. Recently, Michael Burway has issued a call for public sociology. He envisions a social science engaging with publics in a process of mutual education to, as he puts it, make visible the invisible, to make the private public, to validate these organic connections as part of our sociological life. Through public sociology runs a strong current of pre-modern populism and humanism, a great distrust of both market economies and the modern state, and their assorted bureaucracies and experts. Such a public sociology is skeptical of scientific and expert claims making, preferring to privilege knowledge that emerges from the ground up through social movements or other forms of collaboration. In my study of forensics, neither one of these classical answers of conceptual demystification or new public engagement seems satisfactory, because they both require a move away from the actual work that scientists conduct to derive either alternative explanations or validate homegrown forms of knowledge. Reading Eric Kleidenberg's book Heatwave, I was struck by the difference between his proposed social autopsy and the work of forensic pathologists. While Eric is now credited with putting the lethality of heat waves on the media radar, there would not have been any notion of heatwave mortality if medical examiners had not first causally connected heat with excessive death. Eric's analysis is controversial, innovative, and inspirational, but it does not have much legal traction. Sociologists, like journalists or even relatives, can contextualize as much as they want, but they do not have the expert authority to establish how people died. Forensic experts have monopolized the truth of suspicious deaths. For better or for worse, they are our society's official interpreters of why people die. And it's the study of this emergence of the expertise of hope that may constitute one of our mandates. We then witness those who claim scientific objectivity to relieve suffering, in order to hold them accountable, as Simon called it, or maybe to appreciate and strengthen the social embedding of their epistemic cultures, as I try to do. One warrant for STS, and maybe more specifically for those of us who study scientific medicine, is to investigate the expert apparatus of modern societies to relieve suffering, privilege some hidden realities, render private problems public, and offer hope. We could call this Witness the Expert warrant, with an emphasis on witnessing the purported goals of expertise. This, of course, fits in with recent attempts to map contemporary biopolitics, to distinguish good from bad expertise, and the democratic politics of accountability in expert societies. I see four implications of such a warrant. First and foremost, we have to focus on daily practice of doing scientific work. This is nothing new in STS. I think we have been the most consistent in the social sciences to closely study actual work as it unfolds in laboratories and clinical settings. But the implication is that we ourselves need to have a solid empirical foundation to base our interpretation on. Second, we should conduct research not to rediscover the social world, but the world under study. We should not ask what is social or asocial about forensic pathology, but what is pathological about it. Not how do medical examiners dehumanize death, but what is heart disease when a pathologist claims to have discovered it. Here I'm inspired by Anne-Marie Moll's recent work in the long tradition of ethnomethodology in science studies. Third, such environment means that we put professional norms central, not to presume universalistic key values organizing science, but to see how they are realized in practice. Medical examiners proclaim to autopsy for the public good. But public good prevails when they are confronted with conflicting priorities. Here I depart from Anne-Marie Moll, who doesn't feel it is the researcher's task to make normative choices. Fourth and finally, we should follow the knowledge claims from producers to consumers. And this is where I will fall short today, because for various methodological reasons, you will not find many accounts of how autopsy reports or death classifications are received by their intended audiences. One issue then for STS is to investigate how experts use science to reveal, measure, account for, and maybe relieve suffering. I will illustrate this with my study of forensic medicine, available in most well-equipped bookstores. For centuries, coroners were summoned when people died in suspicious circumstances. Their mandate goes back to the 12th century when officers collected money owed to the English crown. Their main task was to conduct public inquests into suicide and homicide. They convened juries to view the corpse and question witnesses so that the jury could render a verdict. In the United States and Canada today, coroners continue to hold death investigations in some counties, states, and provinces. They are public officials appointed or elected. They do not necessarily have medical backgrounds or training in death investigation. The only qualification to be chief coroner in British Columbia is to be, quote, a Canadian citizen of good character and respected in the community, end quote. During the 20th century, a new death investigator began to run the morgue, the medical examiner. These are physicians, often with a specialization in anatomical and forensic pathology. They do not preside over a jury inquest, but base their conclusions largely on scene investigation, autopsy, medical files, and laboratory tests. Their inquiries take place behind closed doors, out of the public eye. The gradual replacement of coroners with medical examiners is part of the long history of growing medical authority over death. Medical examiners claim to be the better death investigators because they have science on their side. Their science, however, amounts to an anachronistic trait in contemporary healthcare. For centuries, the autopsy has been the touchstone of medical knowledge. The autopsy offered medical students their first encounter with real medicine in gross anatomy courses and presented seasoned clinicians with